The Galactic Council declared humanity an infestation. They smiled and built an empire from it. The vote was already over before I walked into the room. I did not know that yet. I had flown 600 million kilometers on a shuttle that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, wearing my best diplomatic jacket, carrying a speech I had written and rewritten 14 times. I was the first human being to ever be invited inside Helix Accord Station. I had thought that meant something good. My name is Yara Vasquez. In 2189, I was 38 years old, and I was Earth's first official liaison to the Galactic Council. I had spent 7 years studying alien languages, alien customs, alien law. I could speak 4 non-human dialects well enough to order food and make polite conversation about the weather. I could recite the founding documents of the Helix Accords in 3 original languages. I had read the complete diplomatic history of every first contact event in the Council's records that humanity had been allowed access to. I believed, with everything I had, that humanity was ready for this moment, that we had earned it. The station was the size of a small moon. It orbited a gas giant called Virith Prime, which glowed pale violet in the darkness of space. From the observation window of my shuttle, the station looked like something ancient and deliberate, rings within rings, towers of material that no human engineer could have designed, light bending around its edges in ways that made my eyes feel slightly wrong. The surface was not uniform. It had been added to over thousands of years by dozens of species, and you could read the history of those additions if you knew what to look for. Here, a section with the hexagonal geometry of Leth collective construction. There, the flowing organic curves that the Velshara used in their early architectural period. Everywhere, the sense that this structure had been growing slowly for longer than humanity had been building cities. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and told myself not to be afraid. I was not afraid, I was amazed. There is a difference between those two things, and the difference matters more than people think. Fear closes you, amazement opens you. I wanted to be open when I walked into that room. I wanted to see everything clearly, without the distortion that anxiety creates. The docking process alone took 2 hours, 17 different atmospheric checks, 6 identity scans that read things I did not fully understand, things that went beyond DNA and into patterns of cellular chemistry that human science had only recently begun to map. The station's systems were designed for biology that ranged from oxygen-breathing solids to ammonia-breathing gas clouds, and every arrival required individualized processing. I waited patiently in each chamber. I answered every question I was asked. I kept my hands visible and my posture non-threatening, because I had read enough cross-species diplomatic protocol to know that body language communicated volumes before words did. A greeting officer met me at the final airlock, a tall, pale creature from the Leth Collective, bilateral symmetry like a human but with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern across its face, and a voice that came from a structure in its throat that did not correspond to any human anatomy. It spoke to me in careful formal English, which surprised me. I had expected neutral diplomatic standard. Ambassador Vasquez, it said, the council is prepared to receive you. I followed it through corridors wide enough to fit a cargo hauler inside. The floors were made of something that felt like glass under my boots but did not flex, did not vibrate, absorbed sound in a way that made every footstep strangely quiet. The walls showed moving images of stars, of worlds, of the long history of civilizations I had spent years reading about in documents and second-hand reports, but never seen from the inside. We passed delegates from species I recognized from briefing files, the broad-shouldered Gorath in their characteristic segmented armor, the floating, near-translucent Velshara that moved in slow currents of light rather than walking, the Daskari engineers who moved in precise synchronized groups that reminded me of a murmuration of birds, each individual adjusting constantly to the positions of the others. None of them looked at me directly. I was used to that. Humans were new here. We were the youngest species ever to formally request council membership, and newness, I had learned, made established species uncomfortable in ways they rarely admitted. The chamber itself took my breath away. It was circular and massive, built-in descending tiers so that every representative could see every other, regardless of their size or the height from which they experienced the world. The ceiling was open to space, or appeared to be, and the stars above were the real stars, not a projection, viewed through a transparent material that filtered radiation without distorting light. 17 species were seated around the central floor, each at a station built precisely for their biology. Some sat in chairs, some floated in specialized containment fields. One species I had not been briefed on fully, a set of creatures called the Aneth, which I would later learn existed primarily as coordinated electromagnetic pulses. occupied a section of the chamber that looked empty but registered on every sensor I carried as densely occupied. The Vrethanu, the hegemony speaker, existed in a pressurized container of gas that shifted color as it moved, amber to deep blue to something that had no human color name, depending on what it was processing emotionally or cognitively. The sound in the room was a low, layered hum of translation technology, keeping every language audible and comprehensible to every species simultaneously. There was one seat in the center of the floor, one human-sized chair placed alone on the open circle of dark stone. No table, no adjoining seats, just the chair, positioned so that the occupant faced the full arc of the council, and the council faced back. I walked across the floor and sat down. The Vrethanu began to speak. It was the hegemony speaker, the role that opened all official sessions and gave the first voice to any matter before the council. Its voice, translated into English by the room's systems, sounded like wind moving through a narrow canyon, a clean, cool, directional sound with harmonics that the translation could not fully capture, but that I felt in my chest rather than my ears. It said that this session had been called to address the matter of humanity. It said that the council had conducted a comprehensive review of 41 years of human activity in space. It said that the council had reached a decision. Then it read Resolution 7441 Omega. I will not forget a single word of it. I have lived with those words for 82 years, and they are still sharp in a way that nothing that has happened since has quite managed to dull. The resolution stated that in the 41 years since humanity developed faster than light travel, the human species had colonized 14 planets without authorization from the Council or any recognized galactic governing body, had terraformed 6 of those planets, permanently and irreversibly altering their ecosystems, had established unsanctioned trade relationships with 11 non-council species, conducting exchanges of technology, material, and cultural information without the required permissions, had introduced 312 Earth organisms, plants, insects, bacteria, fungi, into alien environments where they had no natural predators, and had already begun spreading beyond any reasonable control, had developed and deployed weapons systems that 3 separate Type 3 civilizations had lodged formal complaints about, and had reproduced at a rate that the Council's own demographic models described as statistically catastrophic for any ecosystem that came into extended contact with human populations. The resolution declared the human species a Category 9 biological infestation. It authorized the immediate establishment of a quarantine perimeter around the Sol system. Any human vessel found operating beyond that perimeter would be classified as a containment violation and subject to immediate destruction without prior warning. Earth would be permitted to retain its existing off-world colonies only under the condition that all further expansion ceased immediately, and that every colony submitted to ongoing council monitoring. All trade relationships with non-council species were to be terminated within 90 standard days. Human citizens currently residing in non-council space were to be repatriated to the Sol system within the same period. The Vrethanu finished reading. The chamber was silent. 17 species looked at me sitting alone in that chair in the center of the floor. I sat very still. I did not speak. I did not move. I was processing something that I did not have an immediate language for. Something that was not quite any single emotion, but was a precise mixture of several. I was looking at the council, and the council was looking at me, and the translation hum was the only sound in the room, and somewhere above us the real stars were burning cold and very far away. The ambassador from the Leth Collective, the same individual who had greeted me at the airlock, who had spoken to me in careful English, who had walked beside me through corridors wide enough to fly a ship through, leaned slightly in my direction. It kept its voice below the translation threshold so that the words came to me directly rather than through the room's system. It spoke quietly, with no cruelty and no victory in the tone. What it had, if anything, was something closer to regret. It said, "You should not have come so far so fast, little ones." I looked at it. Then I looked at the full arc of the council, at the Vrethanu already adjusting its pressurized container to move on to the next agenda item, at the 17 species who were already beginning to shift their attention away from me, because the matter of humanity had been addressed and filed and was already receding into the bureaucratic past. At the chair I was sitting in, positioned not at a table with others, but alone in the open center of the floor, exactly like a specimen placed under a lens, something shifted in my chest, not anger, not panic, not the hot immediate feeling of injustice, though that was present too underneath. What rose to the surface first was something much older and much more familiar. Something I recognized from 10,000 years of human history, distilled into a single moment of personal recognition. I had heard this speech before, not in space, on Earth. Every human being alive had heard some version of it, or read it in history books, or felt its shape in the structures of the world they grew up in. The speech that said, "You are too many, you take up too much space, you move too fast, you do not belong here, you are a problem to be managed rather than people to be considered." The speech given to entire populations of human beings, for as long as there had been groups powerful enough to give it. The speech that had been wrong every time it was delivered, without exception, without a single case in recorded history where it had been right, and was wrong again now. Stood up. The chamber noticed immediately. The hum of side conversations and translation adjustments stopped. The Vrethanu paused its agenda transition. 17 species turned their full attention back to me. Apparently, no one stood up uninvited in this chamber. Apparently, in 10,000 years of council sessions, no one had done it. Apparently, I was doing it now. I smiled. I want to be precise about that smile. It was not a performance. It was not defiance chosen for the effect it would have on the room. It was the expression of someone who has just understood something important. Something that reorients their understanding of a situation from the inside out. The council had spent 41 years watching humanity move through space, had collected enormous amounts of data on our behavior, had run it through their models, and had produced a document declaring us a biological threat to be contained. They had done all of that analysis and had never once asked the question that would have told them everything. Why do humans move the way they do? What are they moving toward? That was their mistake. That was the error that everything else would eventually rest on. I thanked the council for its time in 4 languages. I said that Earth would review the resolution carefully and respond through official diplomatic. I picked up my 14-draft speech, 7 years of preparation, gone unused, and I walked out of the chamber with steps that did not hurry and did not hesitate. On the shuttle home, 600 million kilometers of darkened silence, I sat with the lights off and thought for a long time. I thought about cages. I thought about the history of cages, what they were actually made of, what they actually contained, what the people who built them always got wrong. A cage is only a cage if the thing inside it accepts the walls as final. I had spent my career studying alien civilizations, but in that moment I was thinking about human ones. About every wall that had ever been built around a group of people, and about what those people had done over time with the space between the bars. I turned on the light. I opened a blank document. I wrote one sentence. I wrote they looked at us and saw a limit. Underneath it I wrote we looked at them and saw a blueprint. I read those 2 sentences for a while. Then I closed the document and started working on something new. That was the beginning of everything. They drew a line around our solar system and called it a cage. They sealed it with a unanimous vote and 17 species behind them and a legal authority built over 10,000 years. And they expected us to sit down inside it and wait for instructions. We spent exactly 91 days appearing to do exactly that. Earth's governments issued formal statements of compliance. Every statement was carefully worded, technically accurate, and designed to communicate cooperative intent without making a single concrete commitment that could not be later reinterpreted. Our official vessels returned to Sol space with complete documentary records of their withdrawal. Our diplomats attended every monitoring session the council scheduled with perfect punctuality and engaged in every discussion with the kind of polite cooperative detail that makes a bureaucratic institution feel that a matter has been handled. We filed the required reports. We used the correct terminology. We submitted the appropriate forms in the appropriate formats within the appropriate time windows. On every visible surface, we were the model of a species that had received a sharp correction and was taking it seriously. Underneath that surface, we were building a dandelion. The name came from an old earth plant, small, yellow-flowered, grew in cracks in pavement, in thin, difficult soil, in places where gardeners did not want it, and nothing more fragile could survive. It was technically a weed, which meant it was simply a plant growing somewhere that organized systems had decided plants should not grow. The harder you worked to eliminate a dandelion, the more seeds it scattered. You could pull the flower. The root went deeper than the pulling reached. You could treat the soil with poison, and it would come back the following spring from roots you had not found, from seeds that had drifted to land you thought you had secured. A single dandelion could spread its seeds across a field in a single afternoon on a light wind. The project director who named it was a biologist named Owen Pratt. Owen had spent 30 years studying invasive species on Earth. Not in the sense of considering them problems, but in the sense of understanding them as organisms that had found a way to go where life was told it could not go. He had a very specific opinion about the Council's choice of language. He said that the word infestation was what settled civilizations called growth they had not planned for. He said that the Council had made a fundamental category error. They had seen a characteristic of humanity, our tendency to move, to connect, to establish ourselves in new places, and labeled it a pathology, when what it actually was, from a purely biological perspective, was exceptional fitness. He said this in a meeting of 12 people, in a room that officially did not exist, and the 12 people in the room agreed with him. I was one of those 12 people. I was appointed director of the operation that same day. My mandate was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute, without making an error that could not be corrected. I was not being sent out to fight the Council. I had no authority to threaten anyone or destroy anything or build the kind of military force that would have given the Council exactly the justification it needed to escalate from a quarantine to something worse. What I was being sent to do was make relationships. Specifically, relationships in every part of the galaxy that the Council had decided did not matter enough to watch carefully. This required getting out of soul space without triggering the quarantine perimeter, which was monitored by Council observation arrays, positioned at the standard approach and departure corridors from our solar system. The standard corridors were watched. What our navigation team had quietly identified over the preceding decade were the places where the monitoring network had gaps, sections of space that the Council had never fully instrumented, because no one had ever imagined that anything worth monitoring would travel through them. Patches of dead zone, electromagnetic shadow, gravitational noise that interfered with long-range sensors. The Council knew these gaps existed in an abstract sense. They had never closed them because the logistics of closing them were significant, and the motivation for doing so had never seemed sufficient. It became sufficient to us the moment the resolution passed. Our navigation lead was a pilot named Felix Adler. He had been flying spacecraft since he was 17 years old, and had accumulated more hours in transit than anyone on record who had not been doing it professionally for more than 30 years. Felix approached flight the way some people approach a conversation, with complete attention to what the environment was actually doing versus what theory predicted it should do, and a willingness to adjust in real time based on what he observed. He had a gift for finding the path through that no model had mapped, because no model had ever needed to. He called the routes he designed the quiet roads. I called them necessary. We used both terms. The first world I visited through the quiet roads was Dusk. Dusk was the moon where the Duskari had their primary population center. The Duskari were an insectoid species of engineers and miners who had spent 400 years developing one of the most sophisticated understandings of mineral extraction and processing that existed anywhere in the known galaxy. Their mathematics in that area were not just better than humanity's. They were better than most Council species by a significant margin. They had built up their amateur civilization on the resources of the outer rim asteroid belts, and they had done it with technology that the Council's corporations had been quietly borrowing without attribution or compensation for over a century. The Council's classification of the Duskari as a pre-FTL species in need of monitored development was technically accurate in the narrowest sense. The Duskari did not have faster-than-light travel. What the classification did not mention was why. Developing FTL capability required access to specific rare materials that existed in abundance in the regions of space around the Duskari home system, but that were controlled under Council resource management frameworks that kept the acquisition prices far above anything the Duskari economy could sustain. The Council had not exactly prevented Duskari FTL development. They had simply arranged the conditions so that it could never quite happen, and then classified the result as evidence that the Duskari were not ready. I arrived on Dusk in a small civilian ship registered to a trade consortium that did not exist in any Council database. My crew was 4 people. Felix at the controls, a linguist named Harriet Grant who had spent 6 years studying Duskari communication structures, an engineer named Paul Devereaux who had expertise in FTL drive systems and could explain their construction to anyone regardless of what language they spoke, and Owen Pratt, who came because he said he wanted to see the asteroid belt with his own eyes. And I had stopped arguing with Owen about things that were not worth arguing about. We brought food. We brought a complete set of human FTL drive schematics printed on material rated to survive almost any atmospheric and radiation environment. And we brought something else that was perhaps less expected, a complete compilation of every Council resource management decision that had affected the Duskari economy over the past century, cross-referenced with the Duskari's own economic records, showing clearly what the pattern of those decisions had cost them. The Elder Council of the Duskari met us in a hall carved from solid rock, illuminated by bioluminescent organisms they had cultivated and bred over generations to produce specific qualities of light for specific purposes. Work light, cool and bright; rest light, warmer and diffuse. The light used for formal meetings, which was what this was a steady, deep gold that fell evenly across the stone table and the faces around it without shadow or glare. They were cautious, not hostile. Cautious is different from hostile, and I have always found it worth taking the time to distinguish between the two. Caution is a reasonable response to novelty and past experience with institutions that claimed to be helpful and were not. The Duskari had encountered institutions that claimed to be helpful and were not. They had been doing so for over a century. They were careful people by nature and by necessity. The lead elder on the Duskari Council had a name that translated into English through Harriet's work as something close to Bright Understone. It was a naming convention that described a quality rather than an individual identity, and among the Duskari, it indicated someone who produced clear thought in conditions that obscured clarity for others. Bright Understone had held the elder position for 40 years, and had, I would later learn, been the one who first identified and documented the Council's resource management patterns and their effect on Duskari development 30 years. Earlier no one had listened. No one with power had listened, at least. Bright Understone looked at the schematics for a long time. Harriet translated quietly, steadily. Paul answered technical questions. I let the material speak first, because the material was more honest than any pitch I could have made. And the Duskari respected honesty in a way that made me feel slightly underprepared by comparison. Then Bright Understone looked at me. It said, "You understand that accepting this offer places us in formal opposition to the Council," I said. "The Council classified you as a species that is not ready for development. The Council has been managing your access to the resources you need to develop for a century. I am not sure what opposition means when the institution you would be opposing has already decided, independently of anything you do, what your future is allowed to look like." There was a pause. Bright Understone conferred with the other elders in a rapid clicking pattern that Harriet followed but did not translate aloud, because the content was the Duskari's to keep until they chose to share it. Then Bright Understone said, "We accept." They had agreed before we finished our second day of talks. The subsequent 3 days were logistics, mining rights in asteroid sectors that the Council's management frameworks did not currently cover, human use of transit corridors through Duskari space in exchange for ongoing technical cooperation, a communication protocol that routed entirely through nodes neither party would report to Council oversight systems. By the time I left Dusk, we had signed a document that did not exist in any official record and would not appear in any database the Council maintained. We had also eaten together at every meal, and I had discovered that the Duskari found human laughter deeply and genuinely unsettling in a way that seemed to give them a kind of fascinated pleasure. They had no equivalent vocalization and could not determine from their own biological reference points whether it indicated threat or invitation, or something else entirely. I found this very funny, which made the sound happen again, which made the confusion more pronounced, which I found even funnier. And by the third day several of the younger Duskari Council members had started positioning themselves near me during meals specifically to observe the phenomenon at close range. I took it as a good sign. The Second Alliance required more patience and produced something I had not anticipated. The Velshara were a species the Council had classified as emotionally unstable and barred from institutional participation on the grounds that their empathic sensitivity made them unreliable in diplomatic environments. This classification had always seemed to me like exactly the kind of logic that reveals more about the institution making the argument than about the subject being classified. The concern, stripped of its diplomatic language, was that a species capable of perceiving the emotional states of those around them would be able to tell when they were being lied to. This was framed as a liability. I had a different view. I met the Velshara contact on a neutral transit platform in the Vela boundary region. The platform was small and cold and smelled of recycled atmosphere and the particular chemical signature that pressurized transit structures develop over years of heavy use. I was there with Harriet and Felix and no one else, because the Velshara had indicated that they preferred small groups for first contact, that large groups generated too much simultaneous emotional signal for them to process comfortably. The Velshara representative arrived as light, That is the most accurate description I have. They appeared to human senses as a slow, shifting luminescence that occupied space without having edges you could clearly locate, that moved by changing the distribution of its brightness rather than by displacing its physical form. Occasionally, over the course of our conversation, it would briefly resolve into something that human perceptual systems interpreted as vaguely humanoid. A shape that might have been a face, a suggestion of limbs, and then dissolve back into the shifting glow. Its name, it told me, was Sola. It had chosen an English name for my convenience, from the human word for sunlight. I found this considerate and said so. Sola explained that the Velshara had been listening to human transmissions for decades. Human radio waves had reached the Velshara home region long before any official first contact had occurred, and the Velsharas had found human language fascinating for reasons that had taken them years to fully articulate. They had studied us from a distance, in their way, not with surveillance equipment, but with the empathic resonance that functioned across certain electromagnetic frequencies, the way a sound travels through the right material. Sola said that every species the Velshara had encountered in the Council and its territories experienced emotions in what it described as single-threaded patterns. When a Goroth was angry, it was angry. The anger was clean and complete and uncomplicated by other emotional states. When a Leth felt content, it was content without reservation. There was a clarity to it that the Velashara could read easily and respond to with confidence. Emotions in those species were sequential. One resolved before the next arrived. Humans, Sola said, were something the Velshara had no framework for and could not stop thinking about. Sola said, "You are afraid and excited simultaneously. You are sad and still producing the laughter vocalization. You grieve for things that have not happened yet. You feel joy you cannot explain the source of and do not seem to need to. You hold an enormous number of contradictory states at the same moment, and you navigate between them continuously, and you do not appear to find this difficult or even particularly notable. You are the most complicated emotional architecture we have ever encountered in any form." I said, "On Earth we call that being a person." Sola was quiet for a moment. The light that constituted its presence shifted through several colors I did not have names for. Then it said, "We would very much like to know your people better." The Velshara became our intelligence network. Not spies in any sense that caused harm or violated trust. What they did was pay attention, deep, sustained, empathic attention, in spaces where no one expected to be observed, because no one had thought about the Velshara in any terms other than the Council's classification. They were in rooms during Council deliberations, present at trade negotiations, nearby during the kinds of informal conversations that happen in corridors and dining spaces where the formal record does not reach. They heard not just what was said, but what the people saying it actually felt about what they were saying, which is often very different information. They shared what they learned with us because we had given them something they had been looking for, without knowing how to ask for it. A relationship with a species that was at least as complicated as they were. In exchange, we gave them access to human creative work, music specifically. The Velshara discovered human music, and what it did to them is something I cannot fully describe in words, which seems appropriate given the medium. Sola listened to a recording of a cello piece by a composer named Bach for 6 hours without stopping and then sat in silence for 2 more hours. When it finally spoke, it said that the music felt like being understood. It said that it had spent its entire existence perceiving the emotional states of others, and had never once had the experience of an emotional state being perceived back with that kind of accuracy. It said that a human who died 2 centuries ago had, without knowing the Velshara existed, written music that contained them. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I still think about it. The Goroth work took 2 years before I sat down in the same room with all 7 clan elders, and those 2 years were the hardest consecutive stretch of my career to that point. The Goroth were a reptilian species divided into 7 factions that had been in varying intensities of conflict with one another for over 3 centuries. The Council's assessment was that they were ungovernable, which was the Council's word for a species it had decided was not worth the investment of trying to understand. I had read the actual history of the Goroth conflicts rather than the Council summary, because the Council summary and the actual history were significantly different documents. The actual history showed that the original causes of the major Goroth conflicts were resource-based in every case, that the resources involved were precisely the categories of material under Council management, that Council management decisions over 3 centuries had consistently created or worsened scarcity conditions in Goroth space in ways that a Competent independent analysis could not attribute to coincidence. The Council had looked at 300 years of Gorth warfare, which the Council itself had materially contributed to, and used that record as evidence that the Gorath were naturally violent. Getting all 7 clan elders into one room was a project that I would not have managed without a linguist named Kara Wells. Kara was 29 years old, had spent 4 years on Gorth studies at a level of commitment that her advisors had called obsessive, and she had called necessary, and could read the emotional and social content of Gorth speech with an accuracy that startled even Sola, who had spent years studying human emotional complexity. Kara could tell from the way a Gorth elder phrased a question whether the question was genuine or rhetorical, whether a statement that sounded like agreement was actually a conditional concession, whether the silence after a sentence meant acceptance or danger, or something else that had no human translation. We spent 2 years sending messages and receiving them, meeting individual elders separately, on their own terms, on ground they chose, building enough trust that each one was willing to believe that the others would also be present and would observe the same protocols. I will not reduce this 2 years to a paragraph. We're slow and careful, and sometimes felt like the most delicate engineering project I had ever been part of, which I suppose is what negotiation is. The meeting happened on a neutral asteroid that no clan had ever named or claimed. We arrived first and made the space ready, a table of sufficient size, appropriate environmental conditions for Gorth biology. Food that I had confirmed in advance was acceptable to all 7 factions, because sharing food across conflict lines in Gorth culture was not symbolic, it was literal. It meant that for this period, in this place, you were choosing not to be enemies. The food had to be genuine and correct, or the choice it represented would not be real. I also brought whiskey. It was not a diplomatic calculation. I brought it because I was nervous, and it gave me something to do with my hands, and because in my own experience, the best conversations happen around shared things that you did not plan to need. The first night, no one spoke across clan lines. Everyone spoke to me, through me, around me. I was the safe direction for words that were not ready to travel directly to the people they needed to reach. I listened, and I translated not just the language but the meaning behind it, the way Kara had taught me to hear it. I kept the evening moving without forcing anything to resolve before it was ready. On the second sight, I told them about Earth, not the version designed to impress, the real version. I told them about 10,000 years of tribal conflict over land and water and resources, about wars fought across lines that changed with every generation and were always presented as permanent, about the particular kind of exhaustion that a civilization develops when it has been in conflict with some version of itself for longer than anyone alive can remember the beginning of. I told them that what I had seen in Gorth history was not evidence of a naturally violent species. I told them I had seen people who had been in scarcity for 300 years and had been told by the institution that controlled the scarcity that the problem was their nature. On the third night, the eldest of the 7 clan leaders, a Gorath named Verath, whose face carried scars from a conflict that had started before I was born, put down the cup he was holding and looked across the table at the clan leader he had been seated closest to without making direct eye contact with. For 2 full days, the silence stretched. Then Verath said something in Old Gorath, the formal register. The language of elder speech that Kara had told me was reserved for things said when words were being placed on record in a way that would outlast. The speaker Kara was very still beside me. There were tears on her face which I had never seen before. I said quietly, "Kara, what did he say?" She said, "He said that the human woman has reminded him that his grandfather's grandfather's enemy had the same name as his grandfather's best friend, and that he has been tired for a long time. The agreement was not perfect. Nothing involving 7 parties with 3 centuries of grievance could have been. What it was real. A 40-year ceasefire with verification mechanisms and a dispute council. 3 trade agreements covering the materials that had been fought over for generations, structured so that none of the 7 clans had resource access contingent on the cooperation of another. A joint communication structure where any conflict that rose above a defined threshold would be brought for mediation before any other action could legally be taken. On the last morning before we left, Verath came to find me alone. He was carrying a small instrument and he spoke to Kara, who translated. He said that in Gorth culture, a person who had sat at your fire for 3 nights and helped you see clearly was considered a member of your fire clan. He asked if I would accept the mark. I said yes. The tattoo went on the inside of my left wrist. It hurt considerably, and I did not show that it hurt, because I had learned over years of work with species that were not human that sometimes the most important communication is the willingness to endure what the moment costs without making the cost visible. 6 months later, the council sent me a formal notice. The Vrethanu observed that there appeared to be an alarming pattern of unsanctioned contact between unregistered human civilian agents and non-council species. It used the word metastasizing. It demanded clarification. I replied in 2 words. I wrote, "We're growing." 18 years after they drew the line, 42 species, 600 trade routes the council had no record of, not a single shot fired, not a single threat issued. I had learned the thing that the council, for all its thousands of years, had somehow never learned. The most durable power in the galaxy is not the power to prevent others from moving. It is the power to be the direction they choose to move toward. Make yourself necessary. Make your absence cost more than your presence does. Make the people who were told they did not matter feel, for the first time, like someone was paying attention. Once that happens, no cage holds anyone. An empire is not built with weapons. I had believed this as a principle for most of my adult life. After 30 years of actually building one from nothing, in the spaces between the lines that a larger power had drawn to contain us, I knew it in my bones in a way that made the principle feel like an understatement. Weapons are maintenance. They are what you deploy to hold what you already have when the people who want what you have are strong enough to try and take it. They are expensive, and they create grievances, and they require constant calibration to remain a sufficient deterrent against a constantly changing set of threats. Every civilization that had built its power on weapons had spent most of its energy and resources sustaining that power rather than using it to do anything else. The Council had the largest enforcement fleet in the known galaxy, and the Council had not discovered a new civilization, built a new relationship, or produced a genuinely new idea about governance in 400 years. We had been building for 30 years, and what we had built was something that had no name yet in any galactic political language, because it had never existed before in the form we had given it. The Concord of the Outer Rim was announced on a Tuesday morning by Earth calendar. The announcement went out across the relay web, the faster-than-light communication network that our engineering teams had been constructing for 22 years, disguised as weather monitoring arrays, asteroid survey rigs, navigational beacons, and 6 other categories of infrastructure that the Council's automated monitoring systems had examined and filed as non-strategic. The relay nodes were built from materials sourced through Duskari mining contracts, assembled using Neth structural mathematics, installed along routes that Felix Adler's navigation team had mapped through the same kind of dead zones and sensor shadows that the quiet roads had used in the beginning. The relay web went live simultaneously across its entire length. Within the first 4 hours, it was carrying traffic between 39 species and 17 star systems, all of it moving through channels that the Council did not control and could not monitor. The Council's communication infrastructure had been the backbone of its authority for thousands of years. The ability to know what was being said, between whom, and to control the speed at which information moved. That backbone had a 43% gap in it by Tuesday afternoon, and the gap was structural. You cannot close a network gap by demanding that the network stop existing. My communication director, Arthur Cole, sent me a brief message that Tuesday evening. Arthur was a signal engineer who had worked in interstellar communications for his entire career, a man who spoke rarely and chose every word with the care of someone who knew that precision in language was the difference between an instruction that worked and one that caused a cascade of problems. The message said that the web was holding, that Felix had said hello from Relay Station 12, and that Arthur thought he might be smiling. For Arthur, that message was essentially a proclamation. The Concord Declaration came with a complete public accounting of what had been built. The relay web was the most visible element, but it was not the deepest one. Under it, operating for 11 years before the announcement, the Hearthyards, 17 shipbuilding stations in non-council space, had been producing vessels for Concord member species at a rate that no single species could have maintained independently. The ships were not primarily designed for conflict. They were cargo haulers, medical transports, science vessels, communications ships, long-range survey craft, the material infrastructure of a civilization that had chosen to move and build and connect, rather than to stand still and guard what it already possessed. The Gorath clans had contributed structural engineering expertise. The Duskari had supplied materials processed through methods no one else in the galaxy used. The Neth a small species of extraordinary mathematical intelligence who had been classified by the Council as too isolated and too numerically few to matter, had designed the core architecture of 11 of the 17 yards using approaches that our human engineers described as simultaneously beautiful and faintly alarming in their elegance. The launch with 42 member species. Within the first 3 months, that number rose to 51 as species that had been observing from cautious distances determined that the direction the situation was moving did not favor continued caution. The Council's response arrived within 24 hours and was, as I had expected, formal and furious. The Vrethanu issued a condemnation declaring the Concord an illegal shadow government, a violation of the Galactic Compact, the Helix Accords, and 17 other instruments of Council authority, accumulated over millennia of institutional history. It demanded immediate dissolution of all Concord structures, immediate return of all human personnel to Sol space, and immediate cessation of all activities that the Council had not sanctioned. I was in a working session with the Daskari Infrastructure Committee when Nadia Shore, who had been my primary aide for 4 years by then, and had the particular quality of delivering significant information without adjusting her tone to signal its magnitude, handed me the document. I read it during a break in the session. I folded it and placed it in my jacket pocket. I returned to the session and finished it. Then I went to my office and spent 2 hours writing the reply. The reply said that the Concord was a voluntary association of sovereign species engaged in peaceful trade and mutual assistance. It noted that none of the Concord's activities violated any law that applied to non-Council space. Given that the Council's laws did not extend to territories, the Council did not govern. It said that the Concord's charter and all of its trade agreements were available for review by any party that wished to verify that no element of them was designed to threaten or undermine legitimate Council authority in the territories where that authority legitimately existed. It said that we understood ourselves to be, in the most accurate available description, a neighborhood association. I was aware that this response would irritate the Council enormously. I sent it anyway, because accurate descriptions of things are generally more useful in the long run than comfortable ones. The Council's next move was a fleet deployment. 12 enforcement vessels entered Duskari space with orders to inspect and repatriate the asteroid, mining facilities operating under Concord agreements. The fleet commander sent formal notices to the Duskari administration citing Council resource, management protocols and ordering the removal of all non-Duskari personnel. The fleet arrived at the edge of the Duskari asteroid belt and stopped. They stopped because there was already a fleet positioned there. Not arranged aggressively, not configured for engagement, simply present. 12 human ships with engines at minimal power. 20 Duskari engineering vessels, which were not warships but were built from asteroid-grade materials, specifically chosen for their resistance to directed energy at the frequencies the Council enforcement fleet used, and 8 Gorith clan warships, actual warships, built by a species that had been at war with itself for 3 centuries and therefore knew exactly what a warship needed to be, whose captains had sent one message to the Council fleet commander before going radio silent. The message said, "These are our allies, we are here." The Council fleet held position for 6 hours, then it turned around and left, no weapons fired, no damage done. The Gorith captains told me afterward, with visible disappointment, that they had found the encounter somewhat unfulfilling from a military standpoint. I understood their feeling. I also understood what had actually happened in those 6 hours with considerably more precision than they did. The Council had arrived expecting one of 2 outcomes: capitulation, which would have demonstrated that the Concord was performative rather than real, and which would have been usable to undermine Concord credibility with every member species that was still deciding how seriously to take us. Or aggression, which would have given the Council legal grounds under its own instruments to declare the Concord a hostile entity and bring the full weight of Council enforcement to bear against it. What the Concord had done instead was stand still, present, organized, clearly coordinated across species lines, demonstrably real, and completely, provably non-aggressive. We had put the Council in a position where any action it took would make it either the party that initiated an engagement against a peaceful association of sovereign species, or the party that withdrew in the face of opposition it had not expected to encounter. Both of those outcomes served our purposes. They chose withdrawal. That choice went into every Concord member species assessment of what the Council actually was. What the Council was saying in its private deliberations during this period, I knew through Sola's network, was a more complicated and more interesting argument than the public condemnation suggested. There were council members who advocated for direct confrontation, who argued that the Concord's combined force capability was well below council maximum, that a decisive action early would prevent a much larger problem later. There were other council members who pointed out that the Concord had done nothing technically illegal, that its member species were sovereign, that an unprovoked military action against 42 sovereign species would require a legal justification their own frameworks could not produce. They noted that 6 council member species had made informal inquiries about Concord trade terms in the preceding year. They noted that council traders had been using the relay web for months because it was faster and cheaper than official channels, which meant the council's own economic interests were already partially entangled with the infrastructure they were being asked to destroy. The argument ended without resolution. The council tabled the matter for further deliberation. I had been waiting for something specific from the council, and it arrived that year in a form I had not fully anticipated. The Volshara network intercepted a conversation between 3 council representatives from different species who were discussing what to call us, not in any official sense. In the private exploratory way that people discuss things when the official categories they have been using are no longer accurately describing what they are looking at. One of them said the word civilization in a tone of voice that Sola told me carried genuine uncertainty rather than rhetorical weight. It was not certain that the word applied. It was not certain that the word did not apply, and for a body that had classified us as a Category 9 biological infestation less than 30 years earlier, uncertainty about whether we might be a civilization was a significant development. The archive project continued running underneath all of it, which was perhaps the element of what we had built that the council found most genuinely inexplicable. They could model trade route competition. They could understand fleet positioning. They had no analytical framework for why a species under quarantine had spent 15 years methodically documenting the history, language, oral traditions, music, and cultural records of every non-council species it encountered. It did not fit any strategic category they recognized. It was not leverage in any conventional sense. It was not intelligence gathering aimed at any identifiable objective. From the council's perspective, it appeared to be an enormous investment of resources and attention in preserving information that no one was asking for, and that had no obvious military or economic application. What it was memory. The Volshara had oral history traditions reaching back 40,000 years that never been written down because no institution with the resources to preserve them had ever considered doing so. We did. The Gorith clans had ceremonial songs predating their written language by centuries, transmitted from elder to elder in an unbroken chain that had nearly been severed 3 times during periods of the worst fighting. We recorded them in every format and stored them in distributed nodes across the relay web, so that no single point of failure could erase them. The Preeth, a small species on a cold world at the outer rim's edge, had developed a form of musical mathematics, compositions where harmonic structures encoded scientific principles with a precision that our xenomusicologists spent years unpacking. That was unlike anything produced anywhere else we had ever encountered. We preserved it and studied it, and eventually taught some of it back to Preth young people whose elders had carried it and whose generation had grown up without access to it during a difficult period in their history. George Halley, who directed the archive project for its first 12 years, was a quiet man who had devoted his professional life to the idea that the past belonged to the people who lived it, and that institutions did not have the right to decide which pasts were worth keeping. He did not make speeches about this. He hired people who believed it, and he built systems that implemented it, and he answered every question from every species with complete patience and complete honesty about what we were doing and why. The first time a Duskari researcher accessed the archive and found recordings of ancient Duskari, mining songs, compositions from 400 years ago, lost during a period of conflict, believed to be gone permanently, the message the researcher sent to the archive was short. It said, "We thought these were gone. How did you find them?" George's answer, "We were listening." The loyalty that came from that kind of work was different from any other kind of loyalty I had encountered in 30 years of diplomacy. It was not the loyalty of a client to a patron who could withdraw services. It was not the loyalty of a military ally who stayed as long as the strategic calculation held. It was the loyalty of someone who had been told, without ambiguity, that their existence mattered enough to be kept, that their history mattered enough to be preserved, that they mattered to someone who had absolutely no obligation to feel that way and had chosen to anyway. You cannot manufacture that loyalty. You cannot trade for it or negotiate it. You can only earn it by doing the thing, consistently, without condition, for long enough that the doing becomes undeniable. By 2231, the Concord had grown to 67 member species. 14 of them had transferred their primary affiliations from the Council over the course of the decade, quietly, through economic and treaty mechanisms rather than dramatic declarations. The Council's economic sphere, which had controlled 81% of known galaxy trade at the time of Resolution 7441 Omega, had contracted to 63%. The relay web carried more daily traffic than the Council's official communication network. 3 conflicts that historical modeling would have predicted with near certainty had not occurred, because the Concord's mediation structures had been operating in the relevant regions before the conditions for conflict matured into the thing itself. The Council sent me another communication. This one was different in tone from anything it had sent before. The condemnations had been replaced by something that felt, reading it carefully, like the opening of a door that the sender was not quite ready to admit it was opening. It said the Council was prepared to consider a dialogue about the status of the Concord and questions of formal recognition. It used careful language that meant, in plain terms, that the Council wanted to discuss terms. I was 80 years old. The biotech exchanges of my frontier years had maintained my body in better condition than my age warranted. But 80 years of constant movement and constant thought, and the particular tension of holding a very large and complicated thing together across enormous distances had left a residue that no biotech fully addressed. I was tired in the way you become tired when the work you set out to do is substantially done, and you have not yet figured out what you are when it is finished. I read the Council's message twice. I put it in a file with 53 other communications from Council representatives that had been arriving with increasing frequency over the past decade, all of them signaling some version of the same thing in progressively less guarded language. Then I wrote a single reply. I said, "We are ready to meet when you are ready to listen." Then I found Nadia and told her to begin the preparation process for formal negotiations and include a delegation representative from every Concord member species in the planning. Nadia looked at the list, and the expression she used when she wanted to ask something without asking it appeared on her face. I said, "All of them." She said, "That would be a very large delegation." I said, "That is the point." The Council had developed several new words for what we had become. None of them were kind. But I had noticed something in the patterns of intelligence reporting that Sola's network provided. Species inside the Council, the ones who had voted for the resolution, the ones whose flags were on the document that declared us a biological infestation, were sending quiet, unofficial inquiries to Concord trade offices, asking about membership, asking about association, asking about what the process was. An empire is not built with weapons. It is built the moment the people who tried to contain you start asking how to join what you built instead. I asked to be the one to return to Helix Accord Station. I asked specifically, and I made clear when I asked that this was the one request I was making that was personal rather than strategic. The Council had sent the invitation to the Concord administration, which meant any Concord representative could have led the delegation. I wanted it to be me, not because I had anything left to prove. We were past that in any quantifiable sense by a significant margin. I wanted it because I had been in that room 60 years ago when the vote was cast, and I intended to be in that room when the record was formally corrected dead. There is something about returning to the place where a story started. It does not change what happened. It does not retroactively alter the vote that was cast, or the resolution that was read, or the way I sat alone in that chair with 17 species looking at me, and the Leth ambassador whispering that I should not have come so far so fast. But it changes what those things mean within the longer story. It adds context. It adds resolution in the musical sense, a chord that completes a progression that has been building for decades. The shuttle that carried us to Virith Prime was larger than the one I had arrived in 60 years earlier. It needed to be. Behind it flew ships from 37 Concord member species in a formation that was not military in configuration but was unmistakably organized, unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably a statement made visible. The Gorith Honor Guard occupied 6 vessels. Their captains had asked, through their own diplomatic channels, for the specific privilege of escort formation for this particular journey. And I had said yes, because it was the right thing to say, and because Verith, who was long dead now, whose children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were the current clan leaders, had given me a mark on my wrist that I still carried. The Duskari had sent their full Elder Engineering Council in a ship they had built themselves. Their first FTL-capable ship. designed using the schematics I had brought to Dusk 60 years ago, substantially modified and improved by 4 decades of Duskari engineering, innovation that had taken the human foundation and built something I would not have recognized as related without the history. The Velshara traveled in their characteristic distributed way, spread across multiple vessels and the electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously, present in ways that human sensors registered and council sensors had never learned to read. My aide for the mission was Philip Crane, who was 26 years old and had been born in the year the Concorde launched its first formal announcement. He had grown up in a galaxy where humanity's place in space was not a question but a fact, where the Concorde was not an ambitious project, but the context of his entire professional formation, where the story of Resolution 7, 441 Omega was history that had happened to other people. He was brilliant in the way that people are brilliant when they have had the luck to grow up, with good teachers and enough resources, and enough time to actually think. He was occasionally generous with expressions of respectful deference toward me that I found both touching and slightly comic. On the shuttle, he asked me if I was nervous. I considered it honestly. Then I said no. I said that 60 years ago I had been nervous because I had a speech and a hope and no leverage and no experience of what I was walking into, and nervous had been the correct emotional response to that situation. Today I had 67 member species behind me, and 600 trade routes and a communication network that carried 30% of the galaxies, daily information exchange, and a combined fleet strength that exceeded the Council's in shipbuilding rate, and nearly matched it in total tonnage, and an intelligence network with no parallel in galactic history, and an archive that contained knowledge that every species in the known galaxy had reason to want preserved and accessible. I said that nervous was for uncertainty about outcomes. I was not uncertain about the outcome. Philip thought about that. Then he said, "What are you then?" I thought about it. I said, "Ready." The council chamber had not changed in its fundamental structure. The tiers were the same. The open ceiling with its real stars was the same. The translation hum was the same, slightly updated in the frequency register it used for some of the Concorde species that had not existed in the system's database on my first visit. What had changed was everything that filled the structure. Where there had been one chair in the center of the floor, there was now a long curved table, positioned to face the council's seating arc as an equal surface, not as a specimen platform. 40 Concorde species representatives sat at that table. At the center of them I sat, Philip to my right with his careful notes and his complete composure. Sola to my left, still present as light after all these years, shifted to warmer tones than I remembered from our first meeting, which I had learned over decades to read as the Velshara equivalent of feeling settled and ready. Behind the table, the Gorath honor captain stood in full ceremonial armor, hands clasped behind his back, looking at no particular point in the chamber, but somehow giving the impression that he was looking at all of it simultaneously. He was Vareth's great-grandson, and he had inherited something of the old elder's quality of weight. The Vreth Anu that opened the session was not the one who had read Resolution 7441 Omega. The original speaker had died 30 years ago. This one was younger, or whatever passed for younger in a gaseous species, whose life cycle operated on different timescales than anything carbon-based. Its voice through the translation layer was less declarative and more measured than I remembered. It said that the Council was grateful for the opportunity to meet with the Concorde delegation. It said the Council hoped this session would be the beginning of productive dialogue between two significant galactic powers. That phrase took 4 drafts, Sola had told me. Certain council members had wanted something that described the Concorde in terms that preserved the implication of hierarchy. Other council members had argued that any attempt to suggest hierarchy in the opening statement would poison the meeting before it started, given the arithmetic of what the Concorde actually represented. The compromise of 2 significant galactic powers had been a genuine deliberation. I appreciated that they had made it, and I noted that it had been necessary at all. The council's opening terms were delivered by the Leth representative, 3rd-generation descendant, likely, of the one who had whispered to me in that first session. 3 eyes now instead of 4, which was a natural generational variation in their biology rather than anything significant. It spoke in English to me, which was itself a statement about how the frame of reference in that room had shifted since the last time I had sat in it. The offer was formal recognition of the Concorde as a legitimate political entity, repeal of Resolution 7, 441 Omega with an official acknowledgement that the assessment had been based on incomplete information, and a permanent council seat for humanity, 1 seat, Full voting rights, equal standing with any council member. By the standards of council history, it was an extraordinary offer. I knew it. The Leth representative knew that I knew it. Everyone in the room understood that 60 years ago, this offer would have been the answer to everything we had hoped for. When I arrived with that 14-draft speech and a genuine belief that the council wanted us there, I waited until the representative finished. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said that the Concord accepted the repeal of Resolution 7441 Omega and appreciated the council's acknowledgement that the original assessment required correction. And then I laid out what we were actually asking for. Not one seat at a table designed by and for an institution that would remain structurally unchanged by our admission. What we were proposing was a Galactic Assembly, a restructured body in which every Concord member species held an equal seat alongside every council. Member species, with governance procedures that no longer centered authority in the older members by default. Not because we wanted to dismantle what the council had built. Much of what it had built was worth preserving and was the product of genuine wisdom, accumulated over thousands of years. But because the model of a single institution deciding which civilizations counted and which did not, what was a civilization and what was an infestation, who got to participate and who got locked out, that model had produced 60 years of preventable harm, and we had no interest in perpetuating it with ourselves at the center instead. Beyond that, dissolution of the council's monopoly on faster-than-light communication. The relay web had already made this monopoly factually obsolete. We were asking the council to formally acknowledge what was already true, an independent joint review of every council classification of non-member species as infestation, primitive, or ungovernable in the past 5,000 years. Not to punish the council for those classifications, because punishing historical institutions for historical decisions tends to produce defensiveness rather than correction. To do the actual work of determining which species had been excluded for genuine reasons, and which had been excluded for the convenience of whoever was in power at the time, and to make appropriate and specific corrections to each case. And one final condition that was mine rather than the Concord's, that I had added to the proposal over Philip's gentle diplomatic objection and had been unwilling to remove. I asked that the official record of this session include a formal statement that the predictive models on which Resolution 7441 Omega had been based were incorrect, that the Council's assessment of humanity had been wrong, and that the 60 years since the resolution had proven it wrong in specific and documented ways. I wanted it in the record. Not for vindication. I was long past needing anything that looked like vindication. I wanted it because history is made of records, and records made by the powerful tend to reflect the perspective of the powerful, unless someone insists otherwise. Formally and permanently, in the official archive. I had been building an archive for 30 years. I knew what was lost when things were not written down. The chamber was very quiet for a long time. The Leth representative was the first to speak. It said that we could have demanded more. It said that what we had built over 60 years gave us the capacity, if we had chosen to use it differently, to restructure the council entirely or to position ourselves as its replacement rather than its collaborator. It asked why we had not. I said, we did not want an empire built on ruins. We wanted neighbors. We have always wanted neighbors. That is what the council called a Category 9 biological infestation. That is what it actually was. The Vreth Anu called a recess. Council recesses historically ran between 2 and 11 days. This one ran 9 hours. When the chamber reconvened, the vote was 14-3. The 3 that voted against were the same species that had originally authored Resolution 7041 Omega. I noted that. I noted it carefully, because who resists change and who enables it is data that matters for understanding what comes next. I did not comment on it publicly. The record would note it on its own given time. Philip walked beside me out of the chamber and said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Tired." I said, "Good." Then I told him to go find something to eat, because history was going to continue happening tomorrow. It ran better on a full stomach. He laughed. That was when I understood he was going to be fine at everything he was going to do. I found a small bathroom on the station. The same corridors, the same recycled air and alien geometries that had surrounded me 60 years ago when I walked out of a chamber that had already decided what to do with my species before I arrived. I stood at the sink. The water was cold and tasted of recycled station supply. I looked in the mirror for a while. I am not going to say I cried. I am going to say that the water ran for longer than strictly necessary. Then I went back out. I am writing this from my garden. My garden is on the coast of what used to be called southern Spain. in a house built before I was born, in which I have lived for 41 years. The same span of time humanity spent in space before the Council voted us a biological infestation. I notice that symmetry every morning, and I find it pleasing in a way I cannot fully articulate. Symmetry in history is never coincidence. It is the structure of things asserting itself through the accumulation of choices that individually seem unrelated. In the garden there are flowers from 11 different worlds. The blue ones in the western corner came from a Velshera botanist named Leth Sur, who sent seeds 20 years ago with a careful note, explaining that these flowers bloomed in direct proportion to the presence of other living things. Nearby, the more life around them, the wider they opened. On the Velshera homeworld, where they grew in the wild, they were modest. In my garden, where birds move through the morning air and insects visit the older flowers, and the neighbor's aging dog comes through the gap in the fence most days to sleep in the sun against the eastern wall, they bloom enormous and continuous, in a shade of deep blue that has no clean equivalent in any earth color vocabulary I have found. They were not supposed to be able to grow in Earth's atmosphere. Every analysis before I planted them said the soil chemistry was wrong. The humidity levels were inconsistent. The light spectrum was not what they needed. I planted them anyway. They had opinions about what they needed that turned out to be more flexible than the analysis had suggested. I found this entirely predictable and completely satisfying. I am 120 years old. The biotech that I received in exchange for asteroid access rights and transit corridor agreements across 4 decades of frontier work has maintained most of my body in a condition considerably better than my calendar age would imply without it. My hands still work. My eyes still work. My mind still works in the ways that I value, which is to say it still notices things, still finds connections between things, still asks questions about things that appear settled. My knees have perspectives on stairs that I have learned to negotiate with rather than override, because at 120 there are negotiations that are worth having, and stairs fall into the category of things I prefer to have. The knees cooperation on. I retired from active diplomatic work 11 years ago. I had not planned to retire. The plan, such as it was, had been to keep working until I genuinely could not, which seemed both honest and efficient. What happened instead was that over the preceding decade, the work had grown people who were better at it than I was. Not because my judgment had failed, but because they were younger and faster, and had grown up in the world the work had made rather than building that world from nothing. They knew things as given facts that I had spent decades establishing as true. They had relationships with species that I had spent years earning the right to even approach. They operated in a concord that was, to them, simply the way things were. The air they breathed rather than the structure they were assembling board by board in a space the old order had said could not be built in. Philip Crane is 41 years old and is the Concord's chief diplomatic architect. He leads teams working in 12 active negotiation threads simultaneously across the known galaxy, and he does it with a steadiness, precision that I recognize because I spent 6 years working beside him closely enough to see where it came from and am still sure I could replicate it. He has the particular gift of finding the structural source of a conflict, not the surface argument, but the underlying condition that is generating it, and addressing the source rather than the symptom. He has ended 4 situations that all available models had categorized as escalating towards serious confrontation, and he has done it in every case, without force and without the kind of concession that simply shifts the pressure point, rather than relieving it. I am immensely proud of him in the specific way that you become proud of people you watch develop into more than you could have made them through any direct action of your own. Nadia Shore runs the archive project. Under her direction and the teams she has built and trained, the archive now holds 4,300,000 years of documented galactic cultural history across 912 species. It runs on its own dedicated relay node, redundantly backed across 17 independent storage systems, freely accessible in every Concord language and 17 council languages to any individual or institution that wants it. The team that does the active collection work numbers over 2,000 people across 60 species, including 8 Velshera empathic linguists, who have contributed to translation quality in ways that human linguistic science alone could not have achieved. 3 years ago, Nadia's team recovered the complete oral history of the Prethi collective, a species we made first contact with in 2253. A people whose recent history had included a period of significant social disruption during which the oral transmission of their ancestral record had been interrupted for over a generation. The complete history had been believed lost. It had not been lost. A Volshara linguist had recorded it during a transit through Prethi space 11 years earlier, filed it in the archive, and moved on to the next assignment without fully understanding what they had collected. Nadia's team found it during a routine categorization pass. The Prethi reaction to receiving their complete ancestral record back, within a year of their first contact with us, before they had even finished learning what we were. Nadia described it in her report as the moment she understood what the work was actually for. Not as a philosophical conclusion, but as something she had watched happen in real time, in a room with people whose faces were doing things that did not require translation. I read her report 3 times. I keep it in the same folder where I keep the message from Bright Understone's team asking how we had found the lost mining songs. The Galactic Assembly, which formally replaced the old council structure in 2252 after 2 years of constitutional design work that Philip has described as the most complicated thing he has ever participated in, now includes 114 species. This is not a smooth-running institution. I want to be precise about this because I think precision here is important, the Assembly argues. It delays. It produces compromises that satisfy no one completely, which is the sign of a genuine compromise rather than one party getting what they wanted, while the other party accepts a face-saving description of their loss. It has internal factions and historical grievances and species that do not trust each other for reasons going back centuries that have nothing to do with the Concord or humanity, or any of the things I spent my life building. What it does not have is a mechanism for deciding which civilizations count and which ones can be safely ignored. What it does not have is a structure where one species or a small set of species can classify another's entire existence as a problem to be contained. These were design choices. They were the result of 114 species spending 2 years arguing about what they actually wanted a governing body to be for and arriving, slowly, noisily, imperfectly, at a set of answers. It is not a perfect body. I would not know what to do with a perfect body. Perfect systems are static. They are static because they have optimized themselves against the conditions that existed when they were designed, and conditions change while the optimization does not. Every perfect system I have ever studied in galactic history had eventually been overtaken by conditions it had not been designed for. Imperfect systems are the ones that survive, because imperfect systems have arguments built into their structure, and arguments are how an institution discovers what it got wrong about itself. Last year, a joint assembly initiative between the Daskari and the Neth produced an energy distribution model that has measurably reduced resource scarcity conditions in 6 border regions that every previous analysis had designated as permanently at risk of conflict. These were the same border regions the old council had cited in its documentation of why certain species were ungovernable. They were not ungovernable. They were without sufficient resources, and the institution that controlled access to those resources had chosen to use that control in ways that perpetuated scarcity rather than addressing it. We gave them a different structure, and a different structure produced different outcomes. And the outcomes are documented, and the documentation exists in the archive where anyone who wants to understand what actually happened can go and look. I think about the word infestation sometimes. I have thought about it, in various forms of seriousness and lightness, for 82 years. I think I have finally arrived at a complete understanding of it. Not just what it meant from the council's perspective, but why it was wrong, and why the particular way it was wrong was important and not incidental. The species that classified us as an infestation had stopped moving, not in the sense of physical travel. They still built and traded and sent ships across the dark. But they had stopped changing in the deepest sense. They had achieved a state that their own values prioritized above everything else: stability. They knew where everyone was in the structure. They knew what tomorrow was likely to look like. They had built institutions that maintained this predictability over thousands of years, and they had come to experience the predictability itself as the goal rather than as a means to some other end. And then humanity arrived. We were 41 years into spaceflight. We had no established place, no institutional history, no reason to defer to structures that had been built before we existed. We arrived with the intention of meeting everyone we could find, learning everything we could learn, going farther and building more, and connecting ourselves to everything that was willing to be connected to. We did this not because of a strategic calculation, but because it is what humans do. It is the oldest behavior in our species. We move. We find the edge, and then we ask what is on the other side of it. We have been doing this since before we had fire, and we have not stopped. The council looked at this and categorized it as threat. What they had actually encountered was a reflection. They had seen what they used to be, before the long centuries of institutional success had smoothed away the edges and replaced the hunger with comfort. They had seen the version of themselves that existed before they knew enough to be afraid of what they did not know. And instead of recognizing it, instead of remembering what that quality was and what it had made possible for them once, they had been afraid of it. I do not hold that fear against them, and I mean that without any diplomacy behind it. Fear of the unfamiliar is one of the deepest biological responses there is, built into organisms by billions of years of selection pressure that favored caution about new things because new things were often dangerous. The council was, for all its age and its accumulated wisdom, biological. Their fear was reasonable in the way that biological fear usually is. What mattered was what they had chosen to do with it. They had chosen to contain rather than to engage, to write a resolution rather than ask a question, to build a wall rather than open a door. We chose differently. And we had been choosing differently for 60 years, and the galaxy that existed now was the result of that difference in choice. I set my pen down and look at the garden. The blue flowers from Lethser's seeds are fully open in the morning light. They are larger than my hand, the specific shade of deep blue that falls between the color of midnight and the color of ocean water under a clear sky, a shade that I have looked at for 20 years and still cannot quite name in any language I speak. The neighbor's dog is asleep in the corner of the eastern wall where the sun falls in summer mornings. He is very old and almost completely deaf and has no perspectives on galactic politics that he has ever chosen to share with me, which I find deeply restful. There is a sound from the direction of the coast that I recognize before I look toward it. The Preethi Collective's first official delegation to Earth is descending along the coastal approach corridor. A sound different from Earth aircraft, a slightly lower frequency in the engine harmonics, the particular audio signature of a vessel designed for a world with different atmospheric pressure and different gravity, and a different history of aviation than Earth has. They were scheduled to arrive in the afternoon, but Philip told me when he called last week that the Preethi arrive early to everything. In their language, the phrase for on time translates as the moment before you are needed, which they interpret as a moral position rather than a logistical one. Being present before you are needed is, to the Preethi, the most basic form of respect. I find this quality wonderful. I stand up and walk to the low wall at the garden's edge where the ground drops toward the coastal path and the water is visible below. The shuttle is visible now, pale and silver, shaped unlike anything Earth's aerospace history produced, moving carefully along the assigned corridor with all the correct identification signals broadcasting and all the correct approach protocols followed, with the precision of people who have prepared intensively for this moment. Newcomers always follow the protocols precisely. I recognize the quality. I did it myself. Someone on that shuttle is looking at Earth right now. They are looking at the ocean shapes and the green of the land and the line, where water meets coast, and they are trying to understand what kind of place this is. They are wondering what kind of people live here. They have read the briefings and the history, and the cultural documentation that Nadia's team prepared for them, and all of that preparation has still left them with the fundamental question that no amount of documentation can fully answer in advance. Is there room here for us? I know how that question feels from the inside. I felt it ascending toward Helix Accord Station 60 years ago, pressing my hand against the shuttle window, telling myself not to be afraid while the station grew larger in the dark. I felt the weight of representing every human being who had ever looked at the sky and wondered whether what was beyond it wanted us there. What I would have wanted someone to say to me at that moment is not complicated. It does not require eloquence or ceremony. It is the oldest and most necessary thing that one conscious being can say to another that is new to a place. Welcome. We have been hoping you would come. Whatever you brought with you, your history, your fears, your questions, the things you are uncertain about and the things you are proud of, bring them in. There is room. Nina Holt is 28 years old and has been working in Concord diplomatic reception for 4 years and speaks 6 languages, including 2 Preethi dialects, and has a quality with new arrivals that I recognize because it is the quality I used to have before 80 years of accumulated experience replaced it with something more efficient but less warm. She is down at the port now, ready to meet them. She will give them the welcome and show them the city, and take them to see the ocean, which Philip has told me the Preethi have no equivalent of on their home world, and have been intensely curious about since their first contact, briefings. At some point in the next few days, someone from the Preethi delegation will ask something that Nina will not know the answer to, and that will be fine. That moment of not knowing, followed by the search for the answer, is how every relationship actually starts. I watched the shuttle complete its descent from my place at the garden wall. Around me, the flowers from 11 worlds are open in the morning light. The archive holds 4 million years of stories that will not be lost again. The relay web carries 1 billion messages across the dark between stars every day, in languages that were not speaking to each other 60 years ago. The assembly is arguing about something. Philip's last message mentioned a heated debate about resource allocation protocols in a newly admitted species home system, which is exactly the kind of argument a healthy institution should be having. The Gorath clans are at peace and have been for 40 years. The Duskari are building their 4th generation of FTL ships, each one substantially different from the human design that started the line. Each one an argument in metal and mathematics for what it means to take a starting point and go somewhere new with it. They called us a Category 9 biological infestation. They drew a line around our sun with the authority of 10,000 years of institutional power and unanimous agreement and the complete confidence that the line would hold. We called it a starting point. We were not wrong. What we built is not an empire in any sense that the word carried before we built it. It is not territory held by force. It is not compliance maintained by threat. It is not the extension of one civilization's values across the space of others who had no say in the matter. What we built is 114 species choosing to share a table, because the table is real and the choices it enables are real, and the alternative, the long isolation of categorized separateness, everyone in their assigned place, the door to the unknown kept firmly closed, is worse than the difficulty of sharing. What we built is the open door. Every human structure in space has a door that opens outward. It is a design choice that became a policy, that became a value, that became the thing we are. The door opens outward because an outward opening door says something specific. When you arrive, we do not make you push through us to enter. We open toward you. We come partway. We make the crossing easier than it would otherwise be. This is not a small thing. It is the entire thing. The galaxy was full of civilizations with closed doors when we arrived in it. Doors that opened only from the inside, only with permission, only for the right species at the right time under the right conditions. We were refused at the door. We built our own and left it open. And eventually, not quickly, not without difficulty, not without 60 years of patient and stubborn work, the people who had been standing outside, other doors walked through ours instead. Stubbornness is hope with a longer memory. We are not the strongest or the oldest or the most gifted species in the known galaxy in any single measurable category. We are the most persistent. We are the species that got the door slammed in our face by the largest institution in the universe, and spent 60 years building a better neighborhood outside its walls. We are the species that sat with 7 warring clans for 3 nights and told them stories about our own failures, until the room was ready to try something different. We are the species that listened to ancient songs and wrote them down because no one else had thought to, and because losing them would have been wrong, and because the wrongness of it was sufficient motivation to do the work. We are the species that, when told it was an infestation, smiled and got to work. The Prethi have cleared the ramp. I can see the delegation from here. Small figures in the coastal morning light, moving with the close-grouped caution of people in a new place, following Nina toward the welcome space the port has set up. One of them has stopped at the edge of the landing area and is looking toward the ocean. Just standing. Looking. The way you stand when you encounter something you have read about and imagined and are now encountering for real, and the real thing is different from what you imagined in ways you did not expect, and are still in the process of absorbing. I know that feeling very well. I pick up my pen. I write the last line of this account, which I have been writing in sections for 3 years, in the same notebook I have used for everything important since I was 25 years old. Decisions, observations. The 2 sentences I wrote on the shuttle home from Helix Accord Station 60 years ago that turned out to be the most accurate summary of everything that followed. The line is not for them. It is for the archive, where it will be kept, where everything is kept, where the record of what actually happened will exist as long as anything exists to read it. They called us an infestation. We called it a beginning. And from where I stand in my garden, with flowers from 11 worlds open around me, and a new species stepping off a ship onto Earth for the first time, looking at the ocean with the expression of someone encountering something real for the first time after a long time of only imagining it. It is still only the beginning. Welcome, we have been waiting. The door is open. Come in.